So good evening all and welcome to this today's Economy, Place, Access and Transport Scrutiny Committee. Looking forward to the discussions ahead. I'll jump straight into the agenda. In terms of apologies, I've got potential apologies from Councillor Vassie and I think Councillor Healy and Councillor Ben Burton are on their way. But outside of that, we have a full house. Any declarations of interest from colleagues around the table?
Other than the obvious one, Chair, that we are discussing my motion related to residence parking.
Okay, yeah, I can appreciate you're very interested in that. Thank you, Councillor Whitcroft. Councillor Merritt.
Whilst it's on my declarations of interest, I think it's particularly pertinent to one of the items today, that I'm a member of the York Bus Forum and the Bus Forum committees. So I just record that. I am not here as a delegate from the Bus Forum. I have my own views on bus issues. So,
indeed.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Merritt. Sorry, Councillor Hook.
I probably use the park and ride more than any other member. So I've got an interest.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. I mean, let's take it as a given that we all occasionally. Right. Minutes from the previous meeting. Any comments from colleagues on those? That's a no. Great. Well, I will sign them off. Which brings me to public participation, and we have 3 speakers tonight, which is good. The first speaker is Professor Anthony May, who wants to speak on behalf of the York Civic Trust on parking strategy and the park and ride development. That's as it's typed to me on this sheet. Welcome, Professor May. I think you're quite well versed in this. Whenever you're ready.
Hope so. Thank you, Chair. The report before you makes clear that the council needs to sustain its £9 million per annum revenue from parking. What it doesn't mention is the transport strategy target of a 20% reduction in car use by 2030. And those two may seem incompatible. In practice, they don't need to be. And we set out 4 years ago in response to a council invitation how a parking strategy might be developed. Since then, York Bid has, at its own expense, conducted a detailed study of the pattern of use of city centre car parks and has made that data available to the council. Neither of those contributions is mentioned in this report. The report seems to be suggesting a very piecemeal approach to developing a parking strategy. It offers a somewhat vague timetable in which a parking strategy might be produced in the next 2 years. If the council is to maintain its revenue and achieve that 20% reduction in 5 years' time, then it really needs a parking strategy now. And that parking strategy needs to be compatible in terms of how it deals with parking charges and parking supply. And it needs to be consistent across the different types of parking, on street, public off street, to the extent one can influence it, private sector, public car parks, and res park. We recommend that the committee asks for an outline of such a strategy at the next appropriate meeting. And for our part, we'd be very happy to contribute to the thoughts on that. More immediately, the annex deals with park and ride, and it admits that the process for securing a new contract is quite seriously delayed. It's clear to us, given that delay and the uncertainty over the development of the Mayor's bus strategy, that it makes sense to go for a short-term contract at the moment. But we would argue that that doesn't mean that park and ride should stay unchanged. And there are 3 improvements we would particularly like to see. The first is that at least 2 sites have paid for overnight parking, so that rail users and hotel guests can park at the park and ride sites rather than having to drive into the centre. The second is that at least those two same sites have evening services to meet the needs of the nighttime economy. And then the third, and we were having a bit of a discussion about this before the meeting, is that each park and ride site also becomes a local hub. So that, to take the example we were discussing, the residents of Clementhorpe, Codmanthorpe and Bishopthorpe can access the Askham Bar Park and Ride and use that as the route into town, adding therefore to the connectivity of the outer villages and York's hinterland. All of those we suggest would make sure the park and rides strategy is contributing fully to the council's transport strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor May. That's all very interesting, very much appreciated as ever. I'm sure the committee will take your contributions into account. Cheers. Next on my list, I've got Flick Williams, who is with us remotely. Flick, can you hear me?
I can. Good evening.
Good evening to you too. Again, you're very familiar with this, so whenever you're ready.
Last week, the House of Commons Transport Select Committee published its report. Its chair, Ruth Cadbury MP, said, "It should be a source of national embarrassment that our country's transport services effectively treat disabled people as second-class citizens, denying them access to jobs, leisure, support services and essential services, denying them their rights." The overarching recommendation was, across the transport system, accessibility for disabled people must be recognised as a human right, not a nice to have. Failures should be seen as discrimination, not merely as a customer service issue. A change of mindset is needed at all levels amongst providers, regulators and enforcers. So let's start with the rail service. When closure of the station long stay car park was announced, the notice said that blue badge parking spaces would remain open, but they are fenced off, with a notice directing people to the short stay parking in the North Shed, where there are only 6 blue badge spaces, and they are full every time I pass. 6 spaces is woefully inadequate for a station served by approximately 60 trains per day. And now all station parking has shifted to the York Central side with no step-free access. Every time I'm there, usually filming with TV crews, I'm approached by people with heavy luggage asking me where the lift is. Still no definite timetable for that, of course. Then to the front of the station, I was there yesterday pointing out the tactile paving that has been laid incorrectly, and I watched a wheelchair user get 3 access refusals in succession. They were legitimate refusals, as there was already a wheelchair user aboard each bus, excuse me, in the single space. And that is the consequence of ordering 53 new buses without the 2 spaces that we were gaslit into believing we would have. Don't anybody dare tell me that this is a nice problem to have because it means so many people are using buses, until you have been the one left behind curbside, as everyone else who was waiting boards the bus and departs without you. The new bus stops are significantly further away from the station. They opened without a timetable, map or live departure board between them. As there is no electricity supply, there is no street lighting either, as I found to my cost last week returning late from Birmingham. The lack of light meant I could not be seen either, and the last park and ride bus sailed past me without stopping. I then returned to the station, where I waited 40 minutes for a wheelchair accessible taxi, whilst watching about 25 other people get into cabs from the queue at the rank and be straight on their way. And now I hear that it is not settled that blue badge holders will have exemption from proposed bus gates. Does this council really want to repeat the humiliation of the Reverse the Ban campaign? Measured against the Select Committee's findings, this city has a lot of work still to do and a proverbial very long way to travel. Thank you.
Thank you, Flick. Again, we'll take what you've said into account, and on some of those specifics, I'll follow up on them directly. There's been a couple of issues relating to the long stay car park adjustments. I wasn't aware of the blue badge one, but I know, for instance, there's been concerns about the outstanding pedestrian and cycle access. I think that's recently been fixed, but clearly there's other issues. So thanks for alerting us to it, and thanks for your contribution. Next speaker is Gwen Swinburne, another veteran of public participation.
Thank you, Chair. I've sent my remarks ahead because it's 5 different topics, so it's manageable. Chair, I'd like to reiterate my remarks from your last scrutiny committee on the urgent need for the Director of City Strategy to review the so-called economic strategy. It's alarming that with each changed administration, reviewing our strategies isn't an immediate priority after revisiting the council plan. The national economic framework has collapsed, governance has transformed, and political control has shifted. Yet nearly 2 years on, this and most other council strategies remain unexamined. Please add this urgently to your work plan. Oops. I've lost it. Sorry, Chair.
So I give you a bit of time to find it.
It's my problem because I sent it to you all. Here we go. Okay. Okay. I'm back. Sorry, Chair.
Yes, finally.
The national economic framework has collapsed, governance has transformed, and political control has shifted. Yet nearly 2 years on, this and most other council strategies remain unexamined. Please do add this one to your work plan. Secondly, on my proposal for the first ever land and property asset portfolio review and regular performance updates, I noted members' interest. As promised, I latterly sent committee members resources, including the Runnymede model report. Our massive property portfolio lacks regular performance reviews from officers who have neither volunteered nor been tasked with presenting them in the past. Please agree tonight to schedule both the economic strategy review and the property portfolio review for April or May. No member work is required, just action from the responsible officers. The Runnymede property portfolio model needs no brief. Future reports can evolve as needed. Third, Chair, I was troubled by the dated and patchy EPAC scorecard data, as well as its reliance on the now historic and unrepresentative Talkabout panel. Please add a scrutiny review on the scorecard's relevance and reliability, including a deep dive into the Talkabout panel. Chair, on the Res Park issue, please consider making the entire city a Res Park zone. This could boost finances for the council, improve safety and enhance traffic flow. With Res Park profits so high, effectively a tax, there's no reason why inner wards only should bear it. Finally, Chair, on the park and ride, the 9 service from Monk's Cross is far from an exemplar. Users face overcrowded single deckers. Please address this long-standing issue and consult on relocating the outbound bus stop to Monkgate and return stop just before Eber Arkham Way. This would support Goodram Gate trade, serve students at the university, Groves residents, and the new flats at the gasworks, as well as Foss Bank, boosting patronage. Can finally the officer explain why the park and ride tender is now too late to be handled properly? We've known the dates for many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Appreciate you've raised a wide variety of issues there. We'll do our best to pick them up, and on the property portfolio asset review, I would like that in the work plan. The committee wants that in the work plan. I found out today that, oh no, within the last week, forgive me, that something we were expecting in April cannot come to April, which I'll get on to. So there is space, but the trouble is when you get told by one part of the council a report won't be done, you then have to go to other parts of the council at short notice to say, can you fill a gap for us? So we'll do our best, but thank you. Cheers. Right. Welcome, Councillor Vassey. Okay, colleagues, so we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is Finance and Performance Monitoring Report for Q3. Another regular at the table, Mr. Patrick Looker, and welcome once again. If you could give a brief overview, we could take the papers as read and we'll get into any questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So yes, this is the Q3 report, which covers finance and performance data for the service areas. The report was considered by executive a couple of months ago, the end of January 2025. Provides members with details of the overall financial position of the council, the gross overspend projected of 2.6 million at the time. From paragraph 23, there's more detailed analysis of the financial position across transport, environment and planning, and also city development services. There is a forecast underspend across transport, environment and planning, just short of £900,000, which has been increasing over the year. It was about 600,000 at Monitor 2. And from paragraph 31, the business intelligence team identified the performance scorecards relating to the council plan and the full set of indicators as shown in Annex 1. So, as always, we'll try our best to answer the questions where we can. If we don't have officers around the table who can support, I'll obviously get information back to you in due course. But James is here who can help with a lot of the transport, environment and planning side, but we're probably a bit lacking in the economic development side with officers tonight.
Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. Colleagues, anyone want to get the ball rolling? Councillor Woodcroft.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this report. On page 13.10, there's a reference to the transfer of an external homelessness service into the council. It says an extra 87,000 has been procured or been secured rather. Was that an external grant or was that from internal council funding? And could you just maybe explain a little bit more about how we've been able to get the 29 extra emergency beds and how that's working effectively for us?
Yeah, well, I can certainly confirm that the £87,000 was from external funding, but I think it's fair to say that that's part of the global report that goes through to executive. The particular remit of that would be in the health and adult social care and housing scrutiny. So it would be that area which would go into the further detail around the emergency beds. But if you do have a question, I'd be more than happy to take it outside.
Thank you. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Yeah. So on page 13 as well, it talks about the council's pension credit campaign. And it says it's resulted in 100 pensioner households receiving over 662,000 per year, which is obviously an enormous figure. Presumably, there must be a lot more than 100 people that we can potentially help by drawing attention to the availability of credit. Do you have any sort of idea how many more there might be, Patrick, and related to that, how we can potentially, reach out to them? I'm thinking of things like, parish councils and stuff that could help raise awareness. But I've got another question after that, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have details at this point, but again, I can get officers into contact with you to sort of explain the processes we're going through and which families we're getting involved in that.
Thanks. Yeah, because obviously 6,000 plus per household is a lot of money. The second one is on page 15, where it talks about, and I know in the report you sort of say we're not as overspent as we have been, and obviously that's welcome. But the warning about we need to carefully monitor spend, etc., further mitigation, blah blah blah. It is possible it might not be reduced to the point the outturn will be within the approved budget. And then you point out the 6.9 million of general reserves that could be called upon. Is that a standard paragraph? Because to me that seemed quite strong, and I don't recall particularly reading that in the past.
It's interesting this financial year because we're in a much better position than we have been historically, but we're still forecasting an overspend. So what this paragraph is trying to show is that we can't be too relaxed about the fact that we're in a better position than where we've been in the past, because if we are to overspend, we potentially will need to take money out of general reserves. And the first thing you have to do when you take money out of general reserves is to take a report to council to say we need to put funding back into general reserves. So the paragraph is kind of there to say things are looking better, but we've still got to work hard to ensure that we bring budgets in online. So we can't be too complacent. So that's what we're trying to. It's not that, oh, don't worry. We managed to bring the budget in online last year with a small overspend, but it's just keeping an eye on the ball that things are still very tough financially, and we've got to be very wary.
Thank you. Is that a hand, Councillor Bassett? Well, you're next in line, so fire away.
Thank you, Chair. So we'll start around this time last year, I think, we discussed the percentage of procurement that went without a purchase order. And I think it was revealed that this was over 50% of all purchasing didn't involve a purchase order. Could you tell us if that situation has improved?
I think that's an issue that's been taken up with Audit and Governance Committee, and that's where the reports have been going to. So we'd need to bring the particular experts in who've been compiling those reports to take that one forward, really.
Right, so you can't answer that one. Okay. The second thing that I wanted to cover initially is this is part of the history of the City Council to me. We see money we're spending, we see money coming in from government. We very rarely see any sense of generating new income streams. And I would say that would be from energy, intellectual property, tourism, infrastructure, public-private partnerships. Does the City Council make use of the LGA's advanced commercial group to work with other local authorities to develop innovative income streams through commercial activities?
I'm not aware of specifically using that particular group, but we officers in various areas of the council will speak to colleagues in other networks as to what they are doing and seek opportunities for where we can be more entrepreneurial, should I say. One thing that we've incorporated within the budget for 25-26 that members approved was the transformation programme. So that will be looking at different ways of how the council works and how it operates and how we can do the same with less or potentially further external funding to support us. So it's an ongoing task that we have. What I think it's also fair to say is that a number of authorities who have been particularly innovative, who have been particularly entrepreneurial, are those which are struggling with requiring extra government support, where for good reasons they've potentially gone out and tried to make additional funds, whether that's through energy generation and the like, but found that local authorities aren't necessarily the best place to be in a market where they're out of control. So we've always got to be very careful with the risk that the council is taking on when doing such things. So it's that balance of entrepreneurial but risk analysis as well.
Would I be correct then in thinking that the City Council hasn't made use of the commercial skills training available for senior officers by the LGA, for example? Because I'm aware that there are a lot of local authorities who use that course that's been developed with the Institute of Directors to help local authorities and to equip them to undertake greater commercial activity. Is that something that we really don't do?
I'm not aware of that particular course, but I am aware of officers going on other various courses that have been brought together, whether it's through Financial Institute. I know Director of Finance and taking some work with CITFA around improvements in transformational work. So there are plenty of resources out there which we're getting support from, but I'm not aware of anyone using that. That's not to say that no one is using that, but I'm not aware of it.
Thank you. I have other things, but I'll pass over to someone else. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Vassie. Councillor Merritt.
Thank you. In terms of the annex with all the performance data, I wonder if I could ask about some of the municipal waste ones. The percentage of waste that has gone to landfill was significantly up in the first quarter, and we don't have any data for quarters 2 and 3. And equally, the missed collections has gone up this year quite substantially and persistently through all 3 quarters so far. I wondered if we could have some explanations at some point, if not today.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any particular issues around AWD Allerton Park, where the majority of our waste is taken to. There's normally a closure at some point in the first quarter, so whether or not it's during that particular point in time that there's a planned closure, but that would have been similar in previous years. So I don't know if James has got any swift.
I need to double check, but there are planned closures, and one of the contingency arrangements when Allerton Park isn't available, if there's either a planned closure or an issue, is that it sometimes goes to landfill depending on what other routes are available.
Okay. And no quarter 2 or quarter 3 data?
No, well, that comes through waste data flow, so we're waiting for DEFRA to verify those results. The missed collections we are exploring. We think that might be as a result that people who now pay for a green waste bin are more likely to report if it's missed. And that's something we're just trying to explore some of the facts and figures behind.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Is that a supplementary, Councillor Healy? Okay, we'll come to you after Councillor Benton.
Thank you. Not so much question, just something to note for the next time we receive a report. On page 38, indicator SLA 04, that's street cleaning, percentage of standard cleansing cases received within SLA, resolved within SLA, has fallen and has kind of leveled off. It'd be worth keeping an eye on that to see whether that's that's kind of the new normal, in which case the SLA probably needs reviewing, and you know, maybe refining in terms of, I know there are some items where the target is less than 3 days, for example, needles, broken glass. So again, not a question, just something to kind of flag up for potential sort of further discussion.
Yeah.
But not in the context of this, but just thought whilst it was in my head, I would raise it.
Thanks, Councillor Benton. Councillor Healy?
Thank you, Chair. Before I ask my question, I'd just like to note to congratulate York Bid, as they've now started to jet wash St Martin's Lane, which is a bit grim. So if York Bid is watching, which I'm sure they are, congratulations. My actual question is paragraph 29, which is about planning and the shortfall in, I believe it will be income as opposed to an increase in costs. Is the service actively recruiting more members of staff to move us beyond a statutory service and also to hit the revenue targets that we've set the service that they're now unable to meet?
Yes is the answer. So we have been for some posts out to the market 9 times. So yes, we are actively recruiting. We've applied market supplements. There is a national challenge around building control because there was a requirement for them to be qualified from July last year with a new set of qualifications required to operate in that industry. It is an industry where we compete with the private sector, so we are facing challenges in terms of recruitment, but we made a recruitment late last year, and we are actively seeking recruitment both through permanent appointment and through agency approaches. So we are doing all we can to fill that gap.
Can I just a quick supplemental? How many people short are you? How big's the team currently?
So the current establishment, this is off the top of my head, so it won't be far out, but it might be 1 or 2 out. At the moment, we have 4 people in the establishment, and at the moment we've got 1 person in that team. So that's why we've closed the non-statutory element of the service. The good news is we think we've secured someone else in the last few days, but it is a challenge, and it is something that conferences and things we are seeing colleagues from across the country experiencing the same challenge.
Thank you for that. And next I've got Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at paragraph 52, and one of the developments is on my patch, so I know a little bit about it. I was just really saddened to hear that out of a development of 267, where the first houses were occupied in 2023 before the election, they only managed to build 11 houses in 6 months. And you think, is that because the developer doesn't want to build houses because they're waiting till the market's better? In which case, how are we ever going to build all those new houses that need to be built for people? Or is it because there's issues with us approving houses? Is it anything our fault or just down to the developer? And is there any way we can get the developers to start building houses a bit quicker when they've got permission?
It's obviously not my expertise, but it's an incredibly complicated rationale between why developers are able to develop, whether it's suppliers that they've got, whether it's properties that they already have that haven't been sold, therefore they don't want to complete new ones until the old ones are set in sale. So there's a myriad of issues around each individual developer. I can speak to some colleagues to see if there's any particular ones. Is that the Burbridge Road one that you're? I'll see what I can find out for you on that.
Yep, Councillor Healy.
Thank you. Supplemental to that one, actually. In the way that you've added a statistic around care homes and how many that's added to the total, could you also, just as a matter of course, add how many purpose-built student housing adds to the total? And also, do we have anything that tracks conversion of a home to a short-term let property? Because certainly in my area, that I would suggest you're getting more losses than you are additions. But I live in the city centre, so.
Again, off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll see what we can find out.
Take that.
Thank you. I've just got a very, well, potentially a quick one, but one of the public speakers referred to the talk about panel, and I have to admit, and I apologise to members of the talk about panel, because this could just be me not being a great councillor, but the only time I ever see the talk about panel ever referred to is in this specific kind of report. How many people are on it? Do they meet off? How does it work? I'm guessing it's still a thing if we're talking about it in these reports, but if as a councillor, it doesn't really cross my radar. Maybe colleagues feel the same. Does it matter anymore? Should we look at something different that's more useful?
Well, there is a group of individuals who are willing to put their time in to support and advise and help the council, but as you can probably imagine, it's not too easy to get new volunteers to do such things. So members will have to judge whether or not it's doing what it's required to do, but it's just a piece of evidence that we use to support how things are going, what weight you put on it is.
Sure. I mean, and it's not in any way to downplay the contributions of those volunteers, but I just think something like that probably could be bigger, better, more involved, but it's not necessarily for this committee. But Councillor Fenton.
Just to say, I'll add that to the list of topics to discuss with officers, because we've been on corporate scrutiny trying to get customer experience on the agenda for best part of a year, but I know that there have been developments in that service area that meant that it wasn't the right time, but we've got a meeting with an officer, so we can add that to the list of things that we'd like to talk about.
Thanks, Councillor Benson. Sure, it's a hefty list as well. So, Councillor Vassie, and then we'll move on if that's okay, colleagues.
Thank you, Chair. So some comments on performance indicators. So I note that there's been a decrease in the number of electric vehicle charging points over the past 2 years, in paragraph 48 and 9. I note that on page 33, we have some worrying information about the percentage of working age population with no qualifications. This has increased by 70% in the past year. At the same time, the percentage of working age population qualified to at least level 4 has dropped by 10%. And the percentage of people, working age population, not in employment has dropped 5% in 2 years. Who are we working with and what are we doing to address this? Because these are quite worrying figures. Oh, and I suppose lastly, since I'm giving performance indicators, the last ones that leapt out at me, the percentage of municipal waste sent to landfill has tripled in the past 2 years. And the percentage of missed bins has increased by 80% in 2 years. Again, what are we doing to address this? I just want to see how we're tackling these challenges.
So I think if I touch on the electric vehicle charging ones, so the number of CYC electric charging points has remained the same. That's what paragraph 48 says. So what we've done as part of our programme is to increase and renew the vast majority of the council charging infrastructure, and we've increased the charging speed that the council's chargers work at. So most of the estate has been replaced, and there are projects underway to further expand that at Union Terrace and at Askham Bar, where there is another project underway looking at the feasibility of another high pub there. So those are underway in terms of expanding that. We work closely with a number of private providers, and indeed the team who lead on EV also provide advice to businesses, community organisations, etc., that are looking to roll out EV charging infrastructure. In terms of the municipal waste, I'll need to dig back through those figures, but that is obviously something that we are keen to drive down. Can you just point me at
page 33, the figures on employment.
Waste.
Oh, sorry, the waste ones.
We've already done.
The waste ones on page 37.
But we've done. I've already answered the question on that point, so I'm not going to do that one. I can't answer employment. I'm afraid I'm not the right person to talk to that. I don't know whether Patrick can.
No, as I introduced at the beginning, we'll probably light on experts from our economic team. Our head of economic growth retired a month or so ago. So, but we'll see what information we can get to support that.
Could we ask Chair for an explanation to be submitted to you and then circulated on that issue?
You can ask, and I will happily ask.
Thank you.
See what we get back. Yeah, thanks, Councillor Vassie. I've got a hand from Councillor Merritt. Was that a supplementary?
Apologies. Yes, it was a supplementary on the EV response. You mentioned two car parks where new facilities. What is the position in terms of the facility that was meant to be provided on Monk Bar Park, where it's been the bases have been there in a derelict state for about 3 years now. I've had previous updates and thought we were finally going to get something done there for imminently, but no sign of it.
That is a project that we are. It's in the same vein as one that should be completed shortly. So we had an issue with power supply, which is always a challenge with EV, which has delayed that project. But the contractor is still there, and as soon as that's resolved, we will get those installed. Not yet, no.
Councillor Healy, and then we'll wrap this item up.
Quick supplemental again on EV charging. We've just removed all of the parking meters in the city centre, the ones that you used to pay by cash. Would that power supply be enough to effectively repurpose into a charging point?
Potentially, but it would be a slow charge. It'd be a very slow charge, so it wouldn't be that dissimilar to what you get at home when you plug in at home, and that can take 8-9 hours to charge. So it would be minimal benefit, and the what you probably wouldn't want is cars parked in those locations for 8-9 hours. So probably minimal benefit to those.
Okay.
In all honesty.
Thanks.
Thanks. It's worth saying for colleagues, we have got to be, well, we would like to input on the EV charging strategy, the new one that will be being put together, if it isn't already, at some point in this committee's work plan. Hopefully our input can have a meaningful impact on it. But yeah, grateful officers answering the questions to the best of their ability, despite some of the lack of coverage in certain areas of expertise. And thanks to colleagues for your queries. We'll move on to the next item, if that's okay. Thank you, Patrick. So, oh, sorry, Councillor Vassie.
Yeah, could we just note this, because we're now looking forwards, I think, to what happens in the next year with scrutiny as well as where we are here.
Indeed.
And when I look at paragraph 67 and I see that there are no environment and climate action implications, and there are no specific procurement implications, I know what that means. What it means essentially is that all of that relates to the recommendations, and the recommendations are only to note. Therefore, we can't extrapolate that there are implications for the climate from whether we note something or we don't note it. But going forwards, I hope that we treat scrutiny more seriously and purposefully, so that when something says there are no direct implications, when we've seen all these things about electric vehicles, about waste collection services and everything else, that we change the way we do this so that we're not faced with these kind of scenarios where we have a pleasant chat and then nothing happens. That was it.
Well, I mean, I get what you mean about the pleasant chat anxiety. I do have it myself from time to time, but some of it is on us to ask the right questions. But out of interest, how would you see that looking differently? What would a better version of what you've just pointed out look like?
I think because the implications relate to the recommendation rather than the content of the reports and the performance indicators, we're not able to draw conclusions on the climate impact or the equalities impact or anything else. We're just invited to comment or the implications only relate to our noting of data. So that's how I would see it being addressed.
Yeah,
I may be wrong.
I mean, it's probably a conversation to continue outside of the committee, but I guess one of the issues is this kind of report covers so many different things. The implication section will end up being vastly larger than the report itself. Sorry, James, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, I think future scrutiny is on the agenda for full council on Thursday, so you could possibly take it up and debate it there.
I'm sure colleagues have plenty to say. Yeah. So look, appreciate the comment, Councillor Vassie. The floor will be yours on Thursday night too, I'm sure. We'll move on to the next item. So we were meant to, well, I was expecting a report looking at parking and sort of helping us with the various different questions and areas we raised about that, and a separate report looking at the park and ride retender. We basically have one that sort of does a tiny bit of the first and some of the second. I have to say, before we get going, in future, I would like officers to speak to me directly if a report can't be met as hoped. I mean, I only got the chance to read these papers this morning. And the first 5 pages are basically saying we can't give you a proper report on parking. It takes 5 pages to explain why we can't get a proper report. It's just not good enough. I do get heads up from officers when there are issues with delivering reports, usually in good time, but this has absolutely not been in good time. Once the papers are out, it's too late. We can't claw it back. The agenda's advertised. So I just want to voice my frustration. It's not on. I appreciate that parking is a massive topic. And as some of the officer comments say, it might be more useful to look at specifics. But speaking as a councillor that's been here for 7 years, I often find that in scrutiny, we're told that something is too big, so we need to be more specific. And then when scrutiny asks for something more specific, we're told there's too many other things going on around it to do anything useful with this really specific thing. So it's constantly flipping. Things are either too broad or too specific. I'm speaking very generally there, but it is frustrating. We'll make the best of this, as this committee always does, and I'm sure I'll get a response on it. But in future, just give me a heads up if there's an issue with giving us a report that we might like to see. I don't bite. We'll have an honest chat, and if we can move things around the work plan, we will. But there's always a challenge with pulling other things in at short notice. So anyway, I do welcome the rest of the report, and I invite officers to give an opening spiel, and then we'll get into questions and comments.
All right. Thanks for your comments, Councillor Taylor.
I mean, would you like to respond to that particular?
Well, some people may or may not know I'm leaving council at the end of the week, so I could potentially give quite a demob happy response to that. There's a big question in my mind about whether those, because this was something that was brought to my attention about a month ago, perhaps.
Yeah.
So there's a question in my mind about whether, because in a previous life I was a transport consultant, and one of the things I did was parking, because I did local authorities and money, basically. That was my area. Typically something like this would be and this is 20 years ago, a £50,000 piece of work. It would be informed by stakeholder consultation, quite a lot of numerical analysis of things like ticket sales. So there is a question in my mind about whether asking a question which is as broad as that in a forum like this is ever going to give you a response which isn't superficial. So I think, and in a way, it might pass back to some of the other things I think about transport in York, transport planning in York. It needs to be done seriously. Often it's not. And I think that can lead to a range of outcomes which are not always good for the council. So I suppose that would be my response to the very specific thing about this report doesn't take us anywhere. Well, it never would. I mean, you've asked a massive question. You're not going to get anything other than a very superficial response to that question within the time constraints that are available for writing it. So I suppose that would be a slight coming back to your suggestion. But that is very,
I welcome your openness.
That's honest and open feedback. But if you want to look at parking, that's fine. We have people in the council who have the skills to do that. But it's a massive, massive task.
I guess what I'd say is you could probably apply similar arguments to lots of other big things that scrutiny still needs to look at. And there are obvious limitations to what scrutiny can do. But there's got to be a middle ground there. Otherwise, scrutiny will never look at anything of any significance, because in theory, you could get, it will be a big consultancy job. Now, look, I welcome your openness. But my very basic ask, and I appreciate you leaving, and I do wish you all the best, is that if there's an issue with putting a report together, as sometimes happens for other reports, just give the chair a shout and we'll have a conversation. It's too late when it's in the paper, and 5 pages in the paper are basically saying we can't give you what you want. But look, sorry to digress, everybody. But I think it needs saying, especially with the scrutiny review that's coming up. Hopefully things can get better. I won't be chairing any committee in that sort of new dawn. I won't be putting myself forward to stand for scrutiny chair in May. So it'll be for someone else to try and help improve. But sometimes conversations can oil the wheels some way when there's difficulties with reports. Anyway, on the if I may, do you want to give an opening spiel on the park and ride retender, which is the sort of main bit of what we have got? I still welcome colleagues coming in with what they want to raise, even if it's on the parking stuff. Councillor Whitcroft, I know it's something you're particularly keen on. But yeah.
So park and ride. So park and ride's been a big success story for York, but I think now to some extent, particularly given all the things that have happened with the bus network, the position is about managing risk. Historically, the service has been revenue neutral, and for many years it's been actually quite a substantial contributor, but there's no guarantee that it will continue to be like that from this retender. So the question really is how you balance the financial risk to the authority with meeting aspirations to improve the service. Some of these aspirations are actually just about preserving some of the characteristics that the service currently has, like electric buses. But some of them are for doing new things. So, for example, new routes or new services. And within this, there's a need to try and maintain some flexibility with the service, firstly, in relation to the MCA's aspirations as it becomes a local transport authority for York. And secondly, in relation to the new powers in the Bus Services Act, which is making its way through Parliament but hasn't been enacted in law yet. So really the question is balancing that and how you balance that within the requirements to retender the service by the end of January. Now, I say in the paper that time is quite short. Now, time is available to do a fairly straightforward retendering exercise, but it is not available to do a retendering exercise which involves making very substantial changes to the services. I was quite heartened by Professor May's comments about 3 improvements, because I think all 3 of those improvements are things that we're taking forward through the BSIP in any case. So I think that was more or less what I was intending to say about park and ride. I think I'm quite happy to open it up for questions. I don't know if James has got some comments as well.
Just to add, I think the added complexity which is in the paper is that concept of the combined authority. So the mayoral combined authority will have responsibility for bus. It is probably a decision point for both authorities to determine whether park and ride sits with that combined authority or not, and there are pros and cons for that consideration. But again, that is part of the rationale about why the relatively straightforward, relatively short-term tender makes sense, because it allows time for those discussions and engagement about what the combined authority's intent around bus particularly is. Is it, you could argue that the park and ride is the closest thing we've got to a franchise model at the moment, and that might be a model that the mayor wants to look at for the future. So all those things are in play when it comes to the combined authority.
Thank you, James. Colleagues, I'm sure we want to jump in. I've got Councillor Ben Burton first, then Councillor Merritt, then Councillor Fenton, then Councillor Buck.
Cheers. Thank you. I'm going to focus mainly on the park and ride, but I just thought on the parking strategy, I think it's a fair point you raise around consultant fees. And I guess it's a question that I'd be keen that we look at in terms of would we be better off as a council pulling some money, you know, if it's going to be 100k to pull some money out of the maintenance budget or whatever the main highways budget to actually fund things like a consultant-led parking strategy, if that's the resource we need to actually drive that, or also the highways design manual, which is on hold, again, just pulling out money to do something that's going to put good practice in place for the next 5-10 years might be a good, wise, sensible thing to do, and I think it's probably worth something being taken forward. On the park and ride, I had 2 questions. One I've already mentioned on email. So the first one was on the contract. I'm going to get quite specific, but I think it's important that we provide flexibility to the MCA as they come forward, especially because they're the highway authority, but obviously they're clearly not in a position to do that now, so we need to find a solution. I guess the question is the options that we do something like a 2-year plus 3-year contract or something like that, but does that provide enough security? I don't know what conversation you've had with the market, so I guess I was interested to understand whether you think that provides enough security. Or the other option is, can we just conclude something like an novation or transfer clause within the contract so that we just transfer over the agreement to the MCA at a time when they're able to provide it? I guess if you might have any thought on that. I had one other specific, which was the one that I mentioned in the email, which was obviously the football club, Bishop White Rose Football Club, use the pitches up at Askham Bar Park and Ride. They've got an agreement with First Bus, and I just want to make sure, will their provision of parking spaces be provided as standard as part of the tender, or can that be provided? And also, if it is provided, can the limitations they have at the moment in terms of weekends and holidays and bank holidays, Christmas and bank holidays, that's the 2, can they be lifted basically, because that restriction was put in because they had to negotiate it with the council at the time, with First Bus at the time, but wouldn't need to now. So that was the 2 points.
So shall I provide some answers to it?
Sure.
So I think this question about the MCA is actually a really is a really difficult question, and it's one that requires a bit of thought. So the MCA are now, although they formally assume them on the 1st of April, the local transport authority in terms of buses, which means that they have the powers vested in local transport authorities under the 1985 Transport Act to provide socially necessary bus services. Now, park and ride falls into an unusual category, I think, because although it is tendered to a local authority, it is not within the strict definition of a socially necessary bus service. So there's a bit of a question about whether park and ride is and it's one for members to consider, whether park and ride is something they want to see pass up to the mayoral combined authority, or whether they want to retain control of it as CYC. Now, there are arguments either way. Retaining control of it under CYC, which actually is how it worked in the past when York was a 2nd-tier authority and York City Council was park and ride tender. So retaining it within CYC means that it can be matched up as part of our access strategy for the centre of York. And therefore more integrated decisions about things like parking prices and parking supply can be made, which assume a degree of control of park and ride too. But on the other side, CYC is obviously exposed to financial risk if there are problems with the service for whatever reason, or the service sees declining viability. If it passes up to the MCA, obviously there's an administrative saving because there are, not insignificant costs associated purely with administering the park and ride contract and administering particularly the re-tenderings, which are quite labour intensive. But there are also potentially some very substantial integration benefits if the mayoral combined authority were to go down a route where it were to franchise some of its services. So it's not an open and shut question. The MCA probably needs 2 or 3 years to establish its position in relation to these things. And the powers it may use are themselves not certain because they are in legislation which is currently passing through Parliament. So there's there is a bit of a conundrum there and about how you resolve that. I mean, I think your second question about Bishop Thorpe, yeah, that things like that could absolutely form part of the, part of the retender, and they'd be something that would be discussed with whichever operator takes the tender on. I think you touched on, 2-year tenders, 3-year tenders, etc. Well, there's a precedent in the sense that the tender competition we ran for Park and Ride in 2016 failed, and therefore it was necessary to re-let it for a 2-year period. So we've done that in the past. It's an option that we could look at again. And there may be something to be said for doing it on this occasion until we can see some of the powers that the MCA would take become clearer. Novating the contract, I think, again, wouldn't be a problem. It need be.
Thank you. James,
Could I just come back on Councillor Burton's opening sort of remarks? So within movement and place plan and that funding, there is a notional allocation for the design guide, and that would probably be an outsourced piece of work, certainly initially, to plagiarise places and pull together the best practice from elsewhere would be the initial concept for that. And a similar approach is in there towards parking strategy as well.
Thanks, James. Making a note of that. Next on my list, I've got Councillor Merrick.
Thank you. Just to add to the committee's knowledge, because I was involved in the development of the original Park and Ride strategy when we were a second tier district authority, and we had an unsympathetic county council in terms of active travel, in terms of public transport, and so on. So we in effect took the initiative locally to try and address that. And we provided the Park and Ride sites as a parking authority, not as a transport authority. We provided them as a parking authority in order to address the pressures at the time on the availability of city centre parking and the pressures from the business community to improve that, but taking the view that the consequences in terms of the inherited proposals we had from Isha of 4 major multi-storey car parks in the city centre was not an appropriate way to develop the city, with a city that was already congested then, that bringing more cars into the city centre wasn't the right approach. So we developed the Park and Rides to enable visitors, shoppers, commuters to get into the city centre by an alternative means that minimised the negative impacts on the city. And I think that perhaps highlights one of the issues that needs to be taken into account. We know that the county council, unlike us, who protected our local bus services, shredded its bus services during this period of austerity, and has a very minimalist provision of public transport, and that indicates, quite understandably in some regards, the different priorities in a predominantly rural area. Can we guarantee that the MCA is always going to be sympathetic to the type of approach we have to public transport in the city? Or is actually our security in terms of actually maintaining our sites as a park and ride? And of course, they're quite valuable pieces of land, apart from anything else, in terms of running. And if I draw a parallel with Oxford was the original developer of park and ride services. That's where I actually learnt about them. And they have continued to maintain directly the park and ride sites that they originally set up. They have additional park and ride sites which were provided by Oxfordshire County Council as the second tier authority when Oxfordshire County Council came round to the benefit of that type of approach. But that has given Oxford City Council skin in the game
in terms of negotiating the optimum arrangements for transport in the city. And we know that the transport and the impacts on this city are one of the big issues in all the public opinion work that's been done by this council over 30, 40 years. Transport is always one of the top 3 issues that residents are concerned about. Do we, as a predominantly urban and suburban identifiable single community, want to retain control over something that is of such importance to residents, or is that something we're willing to give away with, quite severe political risks in terms of whether we can continue to maintain the type of arrangements that your residents want? So I just put that on the table as one of the things that we should be taking into account when we make this decision. If I could then move on to some rather more detailed questions. I think the drift of the paper in terms of a relatively short-term approach is the right one to the park and ride tenders, but it does raise the question, what length of time might be appropriate, because as Julian mentioned, there's a heavy staffing costs in tendering. And if you actually put those in pound notes, it's a very expensive process. And therefore, normally you go for a long contract length so as to spread those costs out over a number of years. Clearly, the shorter you make it, we're going to have those costs twice in a relatively short period of time. The second issue is, with a short contract, I assume don't think I'll be giving away any secrets here. The reality is we're probably faced with a single tenderer at best. So what sort of process do we need for a short term that maximises our chance of not being taken to the cleaners? So I think that's the other question I'd be asking officers in terms of advice for what sort of recommendations we should be considering.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Yes, I was looking at you, Sharon. Yeah, no, those are good questions. I think with these things, and I must admit, I haven't been directly involved, or I've written the paper, I haven't been directly involved in the process. But I do know that officers have been speaking to various bus operators about it for a little while. So there has been some pre-engagement with the market taking place. In terms of what length of time is appropriate, I suppose, the last time we did this, it was for 2 years. Maybe 2 years would give enough time to resolve one or two of the aspects of it. One of the interesting things about the legislation that's going through the House of Parliament at the moment is that it gives various powers to do various things through franchising, including awarding to incumbent operators and setting up municipal companies and things like that. And maybe these are things that ought to be thought through. In terms of officer resource to actually do these things, obviously the amount of officer time that has to go into it is a function of the degree of change that you enact. So a relatively short, almost like for like replacement contract could probably be done fairly easily. And of course, we are always tendering socially necessary bus services. We've got loads of experience in that. We could turn around quite quickly. But obviously, if we were looking at a completely different arrangement of the contract, that is a very labour intensive thing to do, particularly because it's a £10 million business. So on a financial basis, you don't want to get it wrong. It's for an authority the size of York. If it becomes a £10 million business and that only covers 80% of its operating cost, that's no joke. So you need to get it right. So there is work and study that needs to take place, calculations and so on and so forth.
thank you. I missed the end of your line of questioning, Councillor Merritt, apologies, but if I've missed anything material and recommendations, give me a shout. Can I ask very briefly as a sort of supplementary, this conversation around whether this will remain with the local council or the combined authority, have specific conversations about this started with them internally on it, be it their staff or the mayor himself?
It's certainly been discussed with the officer level in
Yeah.
terms of this needs consideration. There's been no more discussions other than this is something we will need to collectively make decisions on. So it has been put onto the officer side's radar. I think it's fair to say that the combined authority doesn't yet have much of a transport function, so probably isn't ready to have those detailed conversations in any meaningful way yet. They're very light in terms of officer support. So that's happened. We've also internally had some advice about where this sits legally as well, and that was actually organised 18 months, 2 years ago when the MCA was even before it properly existed. So we were seeking that advice about what would this mean for this contract, what are the options. So that happened quite a while ago.
Thank you, James. Councillor Bassey, was that a supplementary?
No.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Councillor Healy?
Thank you, James. What's the mayor's current stated policy around this topic?
I don't think I can necessarily answer that, I'm afraid. You'd perhaps be surprised to know, but because I can't tell you, there have been some statements made, but there isn't a strategy position, a LTP position for the combined authority. So I'll just be repeating.
No, that's okay, James.
Politician.
Can I address that to Councillor Ravilius then, as she's a politician?
So, the MCA hasn't formed its transport strategy or its policies underlying it. So I can repeat media headlines, as can you, but I can't say what the mayor's policy is on this. I don't know.
Yeah, if you want to repeat the media headlines, that's fine, because I must admit, I don't know anything at all.
Well, I can chime. There is a high-level framework which was published by the MCA on the 7th of March and is part of the papers as part of that, and that is as far as MCA policy on transport goes at this stage in terms of what's actually being adopted. So I'd refer you to that, but it makes very few specific detailed comments about buses in general, and whilst I'm talking off the top of my head, I don't think it says anything about park and ride. I think it's important to remember that this is not our park and rides are not the only park and rides within the mayoral combined authority. There are other seasonal park and rides for some of the coastal towns.
Okay, I'll check it out.
I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because aside from the sort of argument around more local, accountable transport services remaining with us, there is the sort of operational aspect. How long will it take for them to be ready to run York's Park and Ride if they did actually end up having it? I mean, local authorities, combined authorities, I'm sure the wheels don't move too quickly in them either. Interesting. Councillor Burton, was that supplementary? Okay, I'll add you to the end then, thank you. Next I've got Councillor Fenton. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Just returning to the kind of broader sort of parking theme. When I was sort of thinking about sort of prep for this meeting, I went back to the local transport strategy implementation plan as that's where I always refer back to in terms of what are the short-term priorities, what are the longer-term priorities. So I suppose maybe you didn't know what we were expecting, and and that happens. But I think it will be helpful to understand whether the implementation plan in such that it refers to parking is still something we should we should look to and refer to in terms of the review of residence parking schemes, in terms of modifying the provision of council-owned parking space in and around the city centre by 2026, and the concept of this sort of 2 kilometre radius from the city centre, looking at all forms of parking provision. So I suppose what I'd pictured in my mind is an update on the status of those various commitments as set out in the implementation plan. That's maybe something we could aim to do at a future meeting, accepting we can't do it at this meeting because that's not the paper we've got. But I'm keen not to lose sight of that. Similarly, the paper briefly mentioned some sort of potential interventions in suburban sites, and Acomb Front Street being one of them. There is a very active debate about sort of parking in the sort of pedestrianised area of Front Street, but that's also a cycle route which is well used. So there's all kinds of things in the mix that may come to this committee in as sort of pre-decision scrutiny, where there are sort of particular interventions. I would imagine a wholesale revision of Res Park, I would like to think, would come here for pre-decision scrutiny. So I think that's certainly in my head. I look to the implementation plan as well. Where do I think we're going? And then the discussion is how we make sure we're kind of sort of cited on that. But I'll leave it there and come back if there's anything else to say on Park and Ride that other people don't say.
Thanks, Councillor Fenton. Councillor Hook, you're next on the list.
Thank you, Chair. And Park and Ride's a matter very dear to my heart, and I very welcome the comments that Professor May made about can we make it so it's 24-hour parking so that people in hotels can park there in city centre, and so if you miss your train, you're not panicking like I have done on more than one occasion, or your train's delayed or whatever. So that's wonderful, and that you said you're going to implement that. Also, the one on the hub, because he mentioned Cottonthorpe and Bishopthorpe, but I hope as well we'll get in the little villages of the Askhams and all the villages in, well, York, but Rural West, particularly from my point of view. Other things that I wanted to mention were, and I'll ask the question last, but it concerns on page 48, which is the Poppleton Bar and Rawcliffe Bar services form important elements of the York Central Access Strategy. So the question is, what are the elements, and do we wait until that's all sorted? But given that you mentioned those two, we've got the very real problem at the moment that to get out on the number 2, the Rawcliffe Bar Park and Ride, it has got that horrendous right turn at Bootham Bar, which means that it actually takes longer than the Poppleton Bar one, that despite all the sort traffic lights, sorry, that's double counting the T, all the sort lights going up to the Railway Museum, it still is quicker than the number 2, because the number 2's got to turn right at Bootham. So you've got one bus service, Park and Ride service, right on the main route from Harrogate on the A59 that stops at 6:30 and is quarter of an hour service and is totally underused. The car park's often not that full, and because of that. Is there any way you can build into the system so that you can be a bit flexible, so that, say, if there was traffic lights like there was on the A19 the other day, and you just could not get to Bootham Bar, far less turn right when you got there, to swap the frequency over to the number 59 and tell people in the website, start using the 59, it's going to be more frequent, to balance out the service so people can actually get into town. And that's one thing that I thought might be really good. But also, can we just make the number 59 more frequent, because it's so much better than the other one. The only benefit with using the number 2 now is it lets you get off right at the theatre, which when you've got a disabled mother is brilliant, but they are not designed, these double deckers. One, you can't go upstairs. Even I couldn't go upstairs, far less a disabled person. But you can't park, but nowhere to put your strollers and things like that, so why can't you get back on at the theatre? That's a cheap alternative, because if you can get back on at the theatre, you don't need a stroller. You just get off and get back on right where you are, And okay, you can't go off and go to restaurants and other things, but at least you've got access to that vital amenity. So there's that. And the other thing, it was a bit awful to see on one part that, you know, the hospital bus was cancelled because of congestion. Well, buses are meant to be there to ease congestion. So that was really disappointing. And it also was extremely disappointing because at the same time that that was cancelled, the Tesco car park started to bring in a limited hours that you could park there. So I wondered if there was a deal that the council could make with the owners of the Tesco car park at Clifton Moor to have a few spaces that they could rent for people to use the number 6 as a hospital shuttle. Because that's what it is. You know, if I know I'm going there for just 3 hours or less, but you could never tell with hospitals because you could be waiting for hours and hours and hours, can't you? So that's my other suggestion. Could we do a deal with them? But I'm beginning to think, but it depends on your answer to my question on part 4 or 5, that perhaps we should just leave it for the 2 years until we know what's really happening with York Central and how that works, but perhaps you already know.
A whistle stop of various indeed.
It's about time I did them longer.
Yeah, no, you covered a fair bit there, Councillor Hook. Welcome responses.
Okay, well,
Keep up with it.
no, I've been making notes, but that doesn't necessarily mean I've got them all. So in terms of questions about hubs and overnight parking and how they can be used, there's £4 million of capital expenditure in the BSIP programme to upgrade the park and ride sites. And we're going to go out to consultation on those, I think in about 6 weeks' time. So at that point, we'll be putting plans into public domain about what we're proposing to do. But actually, the plans are quite substantial. So we're providing overnight parking at some of the sites. Some of the sites will be having spaces for car clubs. We'll be upgrading cycle parking, secure cycle parking. We will be providing more electrical vehicle charging equipment. And you know, so there's quite a lot that's being provided as part of that. There is a question about what services will run to it and whether that can be provided later into the evening. There are actually 2 ways of doing that. One way would simply be to provide more park and ride buses running later into the evening, but of course all of the sites are passed by other bus companies and other bus companies' services, and in some cases they run quite late into the night. So maybe there's a deal to be done with say other bus companies along the Tadcaster Road, and they could carry people on a return portion of a park and ride ticket. So that's a discussion to be had, but it strikes me that it's not an impossible thing to crack. In terms of the York Central Access study, York Central Access strategy, it was always envisaged that the two park and rides on the western side of the city, so Poppleton Bar and Rawcliffe Bar, would penetrate York Central and provide a very good level of access to particularly the commercial development and the railway station, both of which are being provided with relatively small amounts of parking. So they are very important, and the continuance of those services to provide that link is going to be very important, and particularly for Poppleton Bar, although use levels for Poppleton Bar, of all the 6 sites, Poppleton Bar is the least used, but we would expect that use level to increase substantially as York Central comes online and starts to attract trips. The problems with the Rawcliffe Bar service having to be relocated, I think, stems annoyingly from the decision to use electric buses. The single deck electric buses that were ordered have the batteries on the roof, which means that they are taller than the articulated buses that they replaced, and we discovered that they won't fit underneath the low bridge where Leaton Road goes underneath the railway. So that forced rerouting of that service on us, and that was very regrettable. Hospital bus and congestion is, it was a real shame that came off. It was actually funded by the NHS rather than us. The difficulty with congestion, buses are supposed to, I mean, there's a fundamental thing, I suppose it goes back to, you know, transport is all about numbers and balances and calculations. It's transport doesn't submit well to trying to solve problems rhetorically, because it always comes down to a calculation at the end. So buses do relieve congestion, but, you know, a typical bus might carry 20 to 30 passengers in an hour. Well, if you remove 20 to 30 car trips, or probably not even that, 15 to 20, because a lot of those cars have got more than one occupant. If you move 15 to 20 cars from the Wheaton Road area, it doesn't make that much difference to congestion. So there's always it's always important to bear in mind that you've got to scale your solution to the problem, and not think that providing a solution solves the problem, because the solution might be to a completely different scale to the problem you're trying to solve. And that's just, to some extent, that's the issue that we had with the hospital bus. Yeah, number 6, and providing a hospital shuttle. I suspect that some of that happens informally now, actually. But yes, it's a good idea, and it's something that could be discussed with Tesco's and one of the other car park owners in Clifton Moor.
Thank you, Julian. Councillor Healy.
Thank you very much, Chair. 2 very short questions, actually. On Power 25, you sort of referenced the fact that last time it was retendered in 2018. At this point, you were considerably further along in the process. Is there any reason why we're so much further behind this time than we were compared to 2018?
I think in 2018, there was a more single-minded focus on that end date. I think on this occasion, perhaps because so much has been going on, there hasn't been that focus.
But is that?
Yeah, 2 questions.
Yeah, I did. Is that a lack of officer focus or lack of executive focus? Okay.
I think it's probably a lack of officer capacity.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Second question is on Power 19, which is one of the reasons actually why I was quite keen to get this on the agenda, was that the funding obtained by the government that was essentially gifted over to First Bus only applies for 5 years. Is that typical? Is that a government condition? Or?
It's a standard condition. I mean, I think the thing that's important to remember about those electric buses is that the money that First got from the government covered 75% of the cost difference between an electric bus and a diesel equivalent. So very roughly, a diesel double-decker bus, when those buses were ordered, cost about £200,000. An electric one cost about £400,000. So it is twice as expensive. The difference, £200,000. The grant covers 75% of the difference. So the grant is for £150,000 per bus. So First is still putting in what it would cost to buy an equivalent double-decker plus £50,000. And then, yes, there is a condition that the buses are used for 5 years in the area of the authority that submitted the bid. Okay. And that's standard.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I've got Councillor Jane Burton.
Okay, I've got quite a few comments and questions. I wanted to go back to what Flick Williams said about the number of wheelchair spaces on the buses. So when it comes to retendering, if it's just short term, then I still think it should be included, because it really is. There are people, two wheelchair users travelling together. There would be would have to travel separately. It's just not fair, and it's our duty to do that. So it's a bit light, I think, in this light report on disability and provision of all sorts of parking for blue badge holders, for instance. It's one that came up whilst you've just been speaking recently, the BSIP money. I don't know if that can be used for the disabled toilet provision at park and ride centres, because I know apparently it was locked at some point. So people mentioning that to me. I don't know if that's still the case. I think the bus driver has at times got off the bus and unlocked things for people. That's not a great situation, but that's not a recent complaint. That was some time ago. I commend Professor May's comments and the Civic Trust suggestions. I think it's a good idea to have nighttime and overnight parking. I know in Geneva they have that very thing. A lot of Swiss cities do. So that people you just can't park in the city. There's nowhere to park. So if you're visiting friends, never mind a hotel, you have to park on the outskirts and get the bus in. It's really good bus service, though, I have to say, and very accessible. And even going across the lake on the boats, which are provided by the Genevan bus service, you can do that. But that's we could just maybe come from Bishopthorpe on a river bus. Who knows? Why not? So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for what they suggested, and they often think very carefully, as I know the TAG group at the Civic Trust. So yeah, it's rather light on blue badge parking, and we need to keep that in mind. And we need to fill our anticipatory duties as a local authority. We have to think about what people need with disabilities. And then my last thing is, I'm concerned that what Flick raised about the bus gate for blue badge holders and around the station. My other comment, though, would be that I know that myself, there are marshals at the station at the moment. So if you're parking in the blue badge spaces, they will let you park anywhere in that short stay car park. And they will filter out non-blue badge holders and won't let them even through. So I do think they are doing quite a good job of providing parking spaces long term in the short stay car park for blue badge holders who are travelling by train. So I don't know, it's a bit of a pickle there, but yes, yeah, I'm concerned mostly about this lack of access to the bus gates for blue badge holders.
Response.
Yeah, well, there's a few things in there. I mean, first of all, wheelchair spaces, number of wheelchair spaces we have on a bus. I mean, that can absolutely form part of the tender spec, and it would be reasonable to ask operators to provide that.
Even the short term.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Written disabled parking provision here. What was that about? Oh no, that was the toilets. The disabled toilets would you may not know the answer to this, Councillor Burton, but were they the toilets at Rawcliffe Bar? Because
I think they may be.
Because we had some specific problems with those units being vandalised, but that terminal block is being replaced as part of the works that's taking place through the bus service improvement plan programme. So that problem should, be removed from that. And as far as I'm aware, it's not a problem at any of the other sites.
Okay.
But at Rawcliffe Bar we have particular problems.
It's good to know.
Yes. The bus gate, that's a separate scheme, and I don't know whether Scrutiny is booking in a session to look specifically at the city centre corridor and what that looks like. So that's probably the opportunity to consider some of the aspects about that. I mean, Professor May's comment to the Civic Trust, I do like the Civic Trust, but I think on this occasion he's come and sort of presented something as a new idea, which was in a funding bid we put in 4 years ago. So yeah, not only is it going to happen, but we've been designing it for months and.
It is going to happen.
Yes, so
yes.
overnight parking is part of the improvements.
That's
that we're
great.
making. We had our consultation, and when you see it in 6 weeks' time, it's, it's not, we haven't included it because Professor May came here and said it. It's because we thought of it years ago.
But nice to know we're all pushing in the same direction.
Yeah.
Have you finished with your response there, Julian? Yeah, okay, well, in that case, I'll move to Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Yeah, was it Truman that said it's amazing what we can do and we don't mind who gets the credit? So I think, have to welcome it happening if it does happen. I think it's really disappointing we're in the position where, these reports are as they are. I think, as you said, Chair, we're expecting different reports. I appreciate the pressures, officer time and everything like that. But I think it's a great shame. And equally on the park and ride, the fact that we're in this, we can't really properly tender at the moment. I think it's incredibly disappointing. I mean, comms are frequently sending out press releases saying park and ride's wonderful, park and ride's just done this, and that we can't get the utter basics ready of something we are good at as a city of park and ride, of knowing exactly when the minute is to be re-tendering in exactly the best way, so we can really be moving straight ahead. So I think that's very disappointing. You do not need to be an expert in game theory to realise that, as Councillor Merritt has said, there is going to be one operator meaningfully involved in this, and that one operator has absolutely got the council over a barrel if they want to, because they know that we can't sensibly walk away. They sensibly very easily can. They can redeploy buses, redeploy people, everything like that. We can't just close down our park and rides very quickly. So I think that is a real shame. Personally, my view would be, and I'm sure it's not where I'm going to go, but I would still strain every sinew to get a sensible, normal term tendering done where we do ask for stuff. I think, put the resource in now. I think that's really important to do. Yes, it's not going to have everything, and there's, paragraph 23 has some of the various different things we could do and how we could work better with the mayor, potentially, and everything like that. I think those would be good to see. But I think we've really got to, work on everything we can do that. In terms of specifics, that we've seen, obviously, Professor May's made a few suggestions. I also think what the bus forum have sent in via email a week or so ago was really good. And I think we should be counting ourselves lucky we've got that sort of input. I think there's a few of their suggestions that were too specific, too sort of micro in terms of different routes for different things, but they would just be personal disagreements. But it's great to have this. I think that's really positive. So in terms of what I'd like to see for the park and ride, I echo the comments of Councillor Burton, except I go stronger, and Flick Williams. The idea that if you're two disabled people going out in wheelchairs, you have to wait one bus apart, I think is absolutely ludicrous in this day and age, if it ever was acceptable. And I think that definitely needs to be in there. So I welcome the fact you said that, Julian. In terms of overnight parking, that's obviously very much a thing I think people would like to talk about and see. Professor May said the point about people coming for a weekend visit. I'm assuming Sunday is the quietest day on the park and ride. I don't think that'll be rocket science, I'm guessing.
No, I don't think it is actually. Weekends are the busiest days.
Oh, crikey, okay.
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head whether Sunday is quieter than, say, a Tuesday, but although we could find out.
Okay.
But my feeling is that actually at the moment weekends are when it's really busy. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, it's less busy. Thursday, Friday is somewhere between the two.
Okay, fine. I'd assume Sunday, but that's just from occasional trips and everything like that. I wouldn't particularly be an expert on it. But I definitely think the whole thing about you come into York, stay in a hotel for a few days, you can park at the park and ride. We should be encouraging that, and I think that's very sensible to do. And if I had to ask, hundreds of my residents, as I did, or literally the 72 or whatever it is that follow me on my Facebook page, what's the biggest thing of the all the response I got, which was literally 2, but I think it's definitely representative of the ward, longer opening hours. That would definitely be the big thing. That's what we want to see, particularly from an Aston Bar viewpoint. We've obviously got the longer hours at Rawcliffe, so I think that's what people definitely want to see. I think that's very important. Sorry, just on the parking, guys, it has been raised with me by one particular person about whether that parking can include motorhomes and everything like that. And I know it's a whole different area, and I have to sort of declare the reverse of a conflict of interest, which is that my partner runs a caravan park, and so she thinks it's an absolutely terrible idea and should definitely not be allowed under any circumstance at all. And if she would watch this programme, she'd be absolutely horrified, but she definitely won't be. Therefore, I can raise that as a thought for something to consider. And then in the one of the bus forum things, they talked about, in addition to the specification needs to be clear, about whether we're looking at separate services for the park and ride, like maintenance of buildings, toilets, vending machines, cafes, cycling partners, and grassed areas. I don't know what we're doing or not doing on that. I don't have a view on how that's done, but I think the hub, I hate the word hub, the little, well, let's call it hub, isn't it? You know what I mean, at the site. They are the absolute bare minimum, aren't they? Whereas they could be a lot more, in my view, London Underground style, where you do have various things that you can potentially go to, so you can get something like milk for the, home and everything. I think those would be really good to do. And the final one, which is the most difficult one, that you will definitely not have time to do in whatever form of short-term tender may look like, is this whole thing about linking in, to the park and ride sites with, different things around. So I've sort of advocated in the past, basically all the villages just loop round and you're endlessly throwing people off at the nearest park and ride. And it could be clockwise and clockwise. It could be both. So you just go to the nearest park ride, and that'd be great. Or many little sort of community transport type of things that would be partly with the park and ride in mind. So something like in Cotmanthorpe, we've got Cotmanthorpe, Bishopthorpe, Acastle, quite a few people at the caravan parks, got a doctor's surgery, servicing York College. And I'm sure every area, looking at Councillor Healy and Strensall, will have these different things that would be relevant and obviously, have a micro community transport. That last one is very difficult to do. The sort of penultimate suggestion of the looping round in some way subsidised is more doable. But I do think on those core sort of points of 2 wheelchairs should not mean 2 buses, longer opening hours, and parking being allowed. I think those would be good steps to take it forward. My big thing, as I say, is to get let's do it as fully as we can, now. And the other thing, just on to come back on Councillor Vassey's sort of commercial aspect, is there is a park and ride in North Yorkshire, but we can't compare the park and ride to go to the cricket in Scarbados with what we're doing. It's just incomparable at all. We have a genuine expertise in this. So, hopefully there's a way we can be shouting out to the mayoral combined authority that we can be leading that sort of greater rollout potentially across the region, because there are definitely places in North Yorkshire where it would work, where they don't have it. So, we could be part of that. That concludes my opening remarks, Chair. So,
Thanks, Councillor Stewart. A lot of valuable, interesting suggestions there. I don't know if officers want to respond. I mean, it was more of a list of asks or wants rather than questions, but welcome responses nonetheless.
Well, I think I've already answered the question about wheelchair spaces. I would agree with that. Longer operating hours, of course, as we said, they could form part of the contract, or you could have a deal with other bus operators that go past it. But one thing to bear in mind about the park and ride is this, the cost of operating those sites is not inconsiderable. And I was, I'm not sustainable transport manager anymore, even though it's, actually I am legally, but it's not the job I've been doing for about 3 or 4 years. When I became the sustainable transport manager, I was a bit alarmed to find out that being contract holder of Park and Ride also meant you were in charge of acres and acres of woodland and some large bodies of water and so on and so forth. The sites themselves are large, but most of them also have large areas of land around them, which are within the red line boundaries of the Park and Ride site. They're not used for parking. And the cost of operating those sites is not insignificant. And I think last time we discussed it with the operator, they thought that about a quarter of the cost of operating the contract, so £2 to £3 million a year, was linked specifically to the sites. And the way the contract is set up at the moment is that the sites are maintained and operated by the operator, and there are discussions about when, I don't know, some of the roadway and stuff the ride needs renewing. There are discussions about, is that wear and tear that's related to the contract term, or is that a deficiency in construction, in which case the council would pick up the cost of it. So there are some fairly knotty questions about how you actually operate it. That is a part of the contract that perhaps could be thought about a little bit, because bus companies, by and large, are not necessarily experienced in running, large areas of parkland and planters. so on and so forth, and there are possible changes could be made there. But another thing Councillor Stewart raised was talking about services to park and ride from the villages. And actually that is, as he was saying it, I was thinking, well, there's a combined authority angle here, because whatever you choose to do with park and ride, those services to the park and ride sites are socially necessary. So they fall within the 1985 Act of Socially Necessary Bus Services, which would be within the remit of the mayoral combined authority to procure. Now, there's nothing to stop City of York Council procuring additional bus services, because any local authority or indeed any corporate body can procure a bus service. It's not only local transport authorities. But there is a question about if you did things like that, it wouldn't form part of the park and ride contract. That would be something separate to do with socially necessary bus services. But how would you actually do that? Is it something that would be left to the combined authority, or is it something that CYC would do? That's an open question to be thought through. Now, in terms of the actual mechanics of doing it, one thing that we are putting in the park and ride sites as part of their upgrade is additional bus stops at some of them. Because I know from my travels around the UK that if you go to Exeter, National Express stops at their park and ride sites. If you go to Oxford, a whole load of the interurban buses which travel from Oxford to the surrounding towns in the Oxford Tube and things like that stop at their park and ride sites. And at the moment, ours are entirely, I think, well, Monk's Cross actually has some services from elsewhere, but the vast majority of the services are simply from the park and ride to the city centre. So I think there is a sense that there's a set of assets that we're not making full use of there. And actually, when we put the BSIP into the Department of Transport, we made a lot out of the idea that Askham Bar could be somewhere where you could catch a Cities App. Now, Cities App doesn't run anymore, but Coastline that provides service to Leeds. The A64 is very congested. When we were doing the local plan negotiation with National Highways, we were very concerned about the impact of the local plan growth on the A64. We made a lot of the idea that we were doing things to the park and ride site to allow them to intercept interurban trips, take pressure off the strategic road network, as well as simply local trips. So that is something that is enabled by some of the works we're doing. When the plans come out for consultation, you will be able to see that there are additional bus stops within the park and ride sites that serve services which are heading, outwards through them. The question is what you want to do with that, and those could be used by very small numbers of services, or they could be used really intensively. But obviously there are clear potential benefits. Services to Hull could go to Askham Bar, services to Leeds could stop at Askham Bar, services to Harrogate at Hopton. So there's a lot of potential there.
Thanks, Julian. I've got, I think, just one question, and then I'll come to Councillor Whitcroft, and then I might wrap up because Councillor Vassie, we're comfortably over an hour on this already. My question is around a sort of genuinely competitive tender process. So I accept, well, I think we all reluctantly accept where we are now in terms of timings and how it'd probably be helpful to do some sort of short-term tender and then come back to the longer term question once there's more clarity around who's going to do this and how it fits with national policy. But when that proper tender comes around, where we do have the right prep time to do it as much as we want or as well as we want, how do I word this in a way that doesn't look weirdly biased or whatever? Can other companies compete with First? I'm just going to get in there. I know that you put in the paper that they need their own depot and charging points potentially. But, I mean, how many firms are there out there that would chip into this? Transdev, I'm guessing, would be one, or not?
Well, I think transport, through my career, I've come to the conclusion that there is such a thing as an awkwardly sized transport scheme. And Park and Ride is a standalone operation. is an awkwardly sized bus depot. So it is big enough that you can't really service it unless you've got a depot in York. So, and a substantial depot. So in practice, the only two people that have substantial depots in York that can do that are First and Pullman, and First now own Pullman. So there's a bit of a question about how that plays out. So that leaves you two options really, and I think the other thing to say, and I was struck by this in the way that things come up on your Facebook feed, and I was quite struck today by something that appeared on mine, which was a series of photographs of a very deserted York from 5 years ago. And I remember coming in here and having to get a laptop from the office, and the office was unheated, and there were alarms going up in the middle of York, and no parking rights to this sort. So you've got to remember that for the last, certainly from this time in 2020 until about this time last year, the bus network was still very much in recovery mode. I think it's reached sort of bit of stability in the last year, but it was, so a lot of what we've been trying to do as officers has been about sort of steadying ship, see how the pieces were going to fall, knowing that actually there are a lot of uncertainties in it, and we were extremely fortunate in getting the bus service improvement plan money, because we bid for competitive funds for that, and that gave us, I think, about £3 or £4 million, which we basically used to refloat the York bus network. And if we hadn't got that, we'd be looking at a much sorrier bus network today. So to some extent, the reason why we are, we've been a bit cautious about reletting things is because of all of that change. Now, I suppose in terms of what you do with the contract now, that there is something to be said for working on the basis that actually there is still some scope for further recovery, and maybe you play it very, very safe with a contract relet for that reason. Now, obviously, for 2 years, it's going to be quite difficult for any bus company to make the case for building a depot in York to serve a park and ride contract. But actually, that was always the case. And when we let it in, or when we attempted to let it in 2016, that contest failed for precisely that reason. I think it wasn't me, it was my colleague Andrew Bradley who led that, but he spent a lot of time doing lots of supplier engagement, went to saw all the bus companies, including some that were not active in York, to try and interest them in coming to the city. And after all of that, we got no compliant bids at all to the contract we were letting. I think for the subsequent kind of 2 year, for the subsequent rebid 2 years later, I think again we struggled to get compliant bids. So I think it is always going to be a problem. Now, the obvious way to counter that to some extent would be how you split the contract up, and does it have to be a single? Because it's a 30, I think it's a 36 vehicle contract, but it's a big, it's a big lump of bus service. So to do that, you need 70 or 80 drivers, and you need a substantial area of depoting. You need the ability to charge 36 buses up overnight. So you probably need quite a lot of installed capacity, or if you're running it on diesel, you need diesel tanks and things like that. So it's it's a large commitment for any bus company to make even for a sort of 8-year period, which is the longest you could procure it for. So yeah, there's some questions. Do you break it up? And if you break it up, how do you break it up? But if you break it up, there is a danger that there are risks associated with that as well.
Interesting. Thanks, Julian. And Councillor Villiers, you put your hand up while I was talking.
Sorry, I was just going to bring in exactly the point Julian's just mentioned, that the way to address that would be to look at breaking up the park and ride contract, which probably if we're doing a short-term contract, there isn't time to do, but that would be the way to break the stranglehold.
Yeah. Councillor Stewart?
Can you just sort of set out bullet points style, what are the risks of breaking it up? And obviously lack of overall branding of that group, but what would be the risks?
Well, it would be operated as a contract to us. So things like branding would form part of the contract. I think the risks are, well, obviously there is more complexity if you're managing several contracts than if you're just managing one. There is a risk that you would reduce some of the economies of scale that First currently have, and that could have an impact across the network. You would lose some of the sort of integration benefits which allow, extra vehicles to be found when services are really busy periodically. So, in the summer, buses are moved from Unibus to Park and Ride to cater for larger amounts of demand. So, I mean, it's not an impossible thing to do, and it probably needs, I would say, maybe for this one, or maybe, but I think certainly for the next one, it needs the pros and cons need thinking through. But again, because it's a substantial contract in financial terms, you need to take some pretty competent due diligence advice on it before embarking on whatever course of action you want to take forward. And I mean, the other thing is the question of maintaining the sites and whether you retain that within the contract also has a bearing on how you let it. I mean, theoretically, you could strip it right back, and you could take all the site maintenance in-house as part of the Parks Department. You could reduce that. I mean, the other thing is it's run on what's called a net cost contract basis. So First, or whoever operates it, keeps all the revenue, but they also take the risk on the revenue covering the operating cost. You could operate it on a gross cost contract basis, in which case the council gets all the revenue, and there are pros and cons of that. You take away the incentives to the operators to market the service to some extent, but you have more control. So there's questions about all of these things, but they need, they would need some proper due diligence doing them.
Thank you. Outstanding hands, and I will draw it there. I've got Councillor Merritt, which may have been a supplementary, Councillor Whitcroft and Councillor Vassy. Councillor Merritt, was it supplementary? I mean, go anyway, either way.
It's what was a comment about the difficulties of contracting. I mean, that has been the case ever since we ran the first Park and Ride. York's predecessor company ran it the first time, and when we re-tendered it, they had us over a barrel and tried to extract an enormous price. So we actually awarded it to another local minor operator, Stevenson's, and that had the desired effect. When we re-tendered, we got a much more serious, reasonable bid out at first, but it was a very difficult period in terms of the development of Park and Ride. But I think Julian's absolutely right that we have problems in this. What I was wanting to move on was to some recommendations, Chair, and I think we ought to make at least some recommendations to pick up some of the key points that have come out of this.
Absolutely. Save them for once Councillor Whitcroft and Councillor Vassy have gone, and then we'll do recommendations. Thank you. Councillor Whitcroft.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's probably good it took me a while to catch your eye because I've calmed down a little bit from earlier. But it does remain the case. I'm just really disappointed in this report. It just has to be said, particularly around the lack of anything to do with parking here and the brief summary that it went over. I'm a little bit disappointed, or really struggling to understand why it's been presented in this way. We know that there is context around what we've been doing for parking, particularly from an economy place tax access and transport scrutiny potential. There was also the motion that I brought through to full council, which focused specifically on Res Park, and that's mentioned at the start as well. And then nothing else on Res Park. I appreciate parking is a big concept, but I wanted us to use this meeting to focus on the specific areas that we can work with as a council, particularly on residents parking. There's loads of examples, particularly around the movement and place plan, which is related to parking as well. That was just mentioned and then dropped immediately in the reports. You know, and if you're not sure of examples, I echo the chair at the start. We need to be encouraging officers to ask us what we want to talk about, what the issues are. Because I really wanted to have a proper debate around this. I know that there are some people who disagree with my views on Res Park. I wanted to find out a proper solution here. I am sorry that I'm coming at the end because it's a bit of a negative note. I doubt I could blemish you last week if I tried, to be honest, Julian. But I did want to make this case because, as everyone knows, I've got a massive reputation on this side of the bench and probably now one on that side of the bench as well, being really passionate about Res Park. But it is true. I mean, this report was 17 pages long. I probably have more emails than that asking for Res Park in the past month or so. In Fishergate Ward in particular, we've got a serious problem where we've got the closest free parking to the city centre. And I've been going on and on about this now for 2 years. Finally got it to a scrutiny committee, and then there's no mention of it in the report. I've been really, really worried about it. And then a suggestion that we need to pay 30 or 50 grand just to understand what's going on. We already know what's going on. We know what the problems are. We know what the solutions are. For me, the Res Park argument has no counter argument. I'm always willing to listen to them. But when it comes to the management of parking in the city, when it comes to residents' access, when it comes to the finances, when it comes to even pollution, we've got a really effective way of dealing with that. But I've got residents trying to get through Res Park in their street, a street by street piecemeal process. We had a motion come to full council, and it just feels like we haven't really made any further progress. Nothing's getting done. I'm getting increasingly frustrated with the system as it exists. It almost feels like it was designed as what could be the most difficult way of getting residents parking and presented. And that's almost like what it is. So, yeah, I appreciate that I'm being a little bit negative here, but I am pretty disappointed in this report. I really want us, Chair, regardless of recommendations, over the next however long it is, whether we've got a new chair, new municipal cycle, whatever, let's have a Res Park specific discussion session at EPAT, because we really need it, and it's something that I'm really desperate for, but not as desperate as my residents. I don't expect a response. I understand if you don't want to, but I really wanted to say that because we can do a lot better than this.
Thanks, Councillor Whitcroft. Sorry, James.
I will come back a little bit. I think it's a fair challenge. As I say, that I'm more than happy that we commit to that further scrutiny piece. There was a paper being drafted that addressed those points, but we just didn't have time to get it into a place where we could present it in a rounded way. So there was a draft, and it was intended as a second annex to that paper that you see before you tonight. Your motion required that we worked with the executive member on that, and we just didn't have time to go through that with the executive member and get it to this committee, which is officer's fault. I'll take that on the chin, not Julian, I hasten to add, but I will take that on the chin, but commit to bringing a future paper back when we're ready. But it won't be that long, is the honest answer.
Okay, I'll come to Councillor Vassie, who's waited very patiently. Then we'll do recommendations, and we'll close this item.
Thank you, Chair. So, well, I'd also made a list of recommendations. We'll come to that later.
Yeah.
But then I do also want to come back to parking because, like you, Councillor Whitcroft, I was aware that we'd kind of flown away from it. This is interesting because, in truth, it does show the interconnectedness of everything, and I recognise that is the stuff of transport. I particularly picked up on the reference to Lambeth. I think it was in paragraph 4 of the report. And I thought that was actually very telling because it highlights how York is completely different to Lambeth. How many villages are there in the London borough of Lambeth? We have 30. Lambeth is part of Inner London. It has no rural communities. So to what degree can those kinds of analyses be helpful in shaping how we look at our city. And at the heart of it, then the discussion that takes place about park and ride and all these other things also feeds into that. Because we are different. For the past 30 years, we have been a city with surrounding villages, and our transport challenges are related to that. And I personally think we still struggle to accept that York is more than just a city. And that feeds into our ability and inability to deal with things like parking. How are people in the villages to access the city? How does active travel feed into that? How does public transport fit into that? How does parking fit into that? And they're all interrelated. And I think we keep on creating banana skins for ourselves because we don't properly look in a coherent way at how all these things interconnect. And when I read about the BSIP funding, I note that 3 years later, we still don't have real-time displays at rural bus stops. We're still waiting for those things. We're still waiting to have coherent plans for the cycle network. I know the executive member cares about it just as I do. I have to say, you know, I very much from the discussion we've had that expecting the mayoral combined authority to save our park and rides seems to me a fairly dodgy decision to make. And I'd certainly encourage we kept control of that. I would draw attention to the fact that I've been spending the best part of a year trying to get those people, the mayor, the mayoral combined authority, to engage with expanding the cycle network. I'm not even getting an acknowledgement on those kind of things. So I think what we've heard from this discussion is everything's interrelated. We've heard the frustration that parking is not being addressed. We've heard some innovative solutions. I, for one, am pleased to have heard the comments made about making better use, commercial use of park and ride, of looking deliberately to encourage other bus companies to make use of park and ride, not necessarily cancelling the contract with First, but to be more innovative and more commercially savvy. I hope that'll contribute to a solution. I can only regret from your point of view, I understand your frustration, Councillor Whitcroft, but I also appreciate from the many years I've sat around these tables, everything is connected. I think sorting out park and ride certainly seems to be the thing that has come out most clearly here. It could have been more, but if we sort that out, that will be a step forward.
Thanks, Councillor Vassie. I will go straight to recommendations because I think we've talked around a lot of the sort of related points now for some time. I'll kick us off with a couple, which I'm hoping have consensus. Maybe not. If not, we might have to have a vote. But given the uncertainty around the position with the combined authority and national policy, and in how we've basically slipped, we've been able to prep a proper tender process. I think the only sensible option would be to have a short-term tender to tide over that period of uncertainty. However, still have some new asks within it, which aren't hopefully too complicated, such as more space for wheelchairs, longer operating hours. I mean, you can add and add and add things to the list, but I'm conscious that the point of a short-term tender would be to keep it simple to secure the continuity of the service in the short term. So that would be one thing I'd raise. And then the other recommendation that was on my mind was to ask the executive member to work to ensure that park and ride provision remains with City of York Council, and that we get clarity on this matter with the combined authority ASAP, because I think they need to be honest about where they are in terms of their organisational infrastructure. We could be 5 years off before they're ready in that sense. maybe I'm wrong, but that's where they're two that come to my mind. Councillor Healy. I've invited you in.
Thank you. I'd slightly nuance the we keep it in-house to we set a deadline with the combined authority on just what they want to do in this area. Because personally, I'll take the opposite view. I'd say this is something that should be going up to the combined authority. My main reason for that is I think there's a lot of things that this council is trying to do where there's significant overlap with the combined authority, and we just lack the capacity to do it properly. So if the combined authority is going to be doing the socially necessary bus network.
But it has. Sorry, the combined authority has the due because it's a local transport authority. It has a duty under the 1985 Transport Act to provide the socially necessary network, or to define a socially necessary network and provide it. So that means inevitably it will end up procuring, you know, all of the tendered bus services that we have around York at the moment. So things like the 12 and the 19.
Yeah. So if they're going to be doing that, and they're going to need staff to do that, how much capacity? Well, in my opinion, and I must admit this is a personal opinion because I can feel Steve's face heating up, is that we're just not going to be able to do it properly.
Well, I think those discussions actually are ongoing with the mayoral combined authority in the sense that there are obviously two ways to attack that particular issue. So they could either employ all the staff and do all of that themselves in-house, or they could passport it back to the two constituent authorities on a commission basis. And that decision has not been made. So it's possible that ourselves and North Yorkshire would continue to do that work. That'd be that would be overseen by the combined authority.
I think just to add to that, I think that there are nuances within that. So it could be that York writes a paper on a bus contract and submits it to the combined authority for a decision. It could be that the combined authority delegates those decisions back to the unitary authority. Having said that, if the combined authority goes for a franchising model, you would have a different response again. So there are so many things at play here. I think what we need to do is work with the combined authority on a clear plan. That's got to be far be it for me to tell you what the recommendation is, but I think you need a clear plan with the combined authority about what the solution is. Yeah. And you might want to put a timescale on that.
So yeah, maybe then to achieve consensus, the recommendation is to, at the very least, secure clarity on the position. Whatever that may be, even though I think it would be awful for York to have even less control of its bus services. But anyway, that's just my opinion. What's that worth? But Councillor Stewart, you had your hand up, then I'll come to Councillor Merritt and Vassy, who now have recommendations.
Well, your opinion is worth lots and lots to answer that point.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart.
Firstly, just on the mayoral clarification, absolutely right to clarify that, but is it worth having a particular ask of the mayor of saying, we are where we are in terms of our park and ride tender, and we're happy enough that we know what we're doing. Our particular ask to you, Mr. Mayoral Authority, is to look at getting more people to our park and ride sites. And we're not sure exactly what the solution is, extra buses route, the 1985 thing, but that's where we'd like you to major on and have that as a particular ask of the mayor, leaving aside everything else. And the second thing was, you talked about the longer opening hours, but I don't think any recommendations you explicitly said about the parking at weekends, which, given that Julian said is happening anyway, I think it'd be worth us being seen to endorse that as part of the changes.
Yeah, forgive me. There's nothing wrong with endorsing stuff that's happening anyway, which we're pleased to see. Yeah. Thanks, Councillor Stewart. Councillor Hook.
Just the two small ones people can get on at York Theatre on the number 2. That's just such a minor thing. And also talking to the owners of the car park in Clifton Moor to try and get a quasi hospital bus out of the number 6.
Yeah, specific things, but I'd happily have the committee back them as recommendations for the exec member to action. Councillor Merritt.
I suggest we slightly generalise the last one. I mean, you know, in the ward I represent, as one of the speakers said, there's a concern about the bus not stopping in Monkgate, and having one that actually suits that access to the city centre, and to, you know, some of the office developments are on Centurion Way. Those types of issues. So I think there's a need for the council to review its policy about intermediate stops. So pick up all the ones that have been flagged today, but there may be others. And there are obvious issues two ways on this. One is lots of stops may deter the primary users of park and ride. Or there may be a compromise in the sense of, well, what do we just do the intermediate stops in the evenings when the ordinary commercial services stop, as was trialled during the latter end of the COVID experience. So it doesn't undermine the local service bus network, but does provide a continuing service in the evening, which local residents wouldn't otherwise have. So I think there are a set of issues in there, but I think we should generalise the recommendation that needs looking at as part of the tender renewal.
I think that's really helpful, Councillor Merritt. Thank you. Councillor Vassie.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I want to go back to this commercial use. If I've understood correctly, City of York Council owns the park and ride sites. We heard that there's considerable amount of land there. We've heard that there are other bus companies that could be using that, aside from whatever happens to the park and ride. So I would really want to see a recommendation that we encourage the executive to make better commercial use of the park and ride sites, since they include significant amount of land, and since they could be used to encourage bus operators to use the sites. When I bang on about it not infrequently, the fact that we derive so much of our money from car parking, however many millions a year, is it 9 or 12? I can't remember where we are at the moment. Other cities earn money from mass transit systems and other ways of looking at things so that they're earning money from the solution and not the problem to climate change. And I would love to see us using this opportunity to look at those sites and say, how could we be part of the solution for transport, rather than how do we just hand it all over to someone else to do, whether it's the mayoral combined authority or someone else. We own this. So let's try and make better use of it. So that is a huge long thing, but simple
paraphrase, yeah.
It was look to make better commercial use of the park and ride sites.
I think there's consensus for that. Any other specifics, colleagues? I mean, we've given a fair few there, and if I may, just to be clear, I would like to think that the equivalent of this committee in the future will get another go at this once the proper tender comes around, once we know the lay of the land. Who knows when that will be? Councillor Fenton.
Just on the point of the issue of should we recommend that City of York Council retains control, notwithstanding the legal landscape that means that it might be a control that is devolved to us. It's really hard to make that kind of decision or recommendation in a vacuum without knowing the combined authorities' ambition, appetite. So I think the best we can do is be clear that whether it's control, we want to retain influence to ensure that whatever arrangements are put in place, reflect the the needs and ambitions that we still exist as a local authority, and it's just trying to not lose the sense that we want to retain influence, however that is exercised in whatever structure emerges. I'm not precious about that. It's just whatever's the most path of least resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I ended up settling for clarity.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm very much with you, Councillor Benton, but I could just imagine a situation in the future where somebody is claiming that we have influence and we actually have none. So yeah, forgive me, Julian.
I was just going to add to that one of the I'm going to spend a whole of this evening saying, oh, there are some terrible uncertainties about X or Y. But one of the terrible uncertainties about this is in 2 or 3 years' time, you could have a position where the combined authority might have a whole load of powers to do with buses which are not available to CYC because it is a local transport authority and we will not be one. And I think that will be a very important input into those kinds of decisions about what we do and what the combined authority do, because it might be that the combined authority is in a position and has stated policy objectives of doing all kinds of amazing things with park and ride and integrating them into other services that we would just be unable to do.
Yeah.
So I think it's just necessary to. I don't know if it needs noting at this stage, but it's something. I mean, certainly as this committee moves forward and you take a longer look at park and ride at some time in the future, that will be a very important thing to bear in mind. And I think the other thing that I would say about park and ride, which we haven't discussed, that is mentioned in the paper, maybe I didn't mention it strongly enough, is how important park and ride is for serving some of the local plan allocations. And there are decisions about certain sites have been made specifically because they are next to park and ride terminals, particularly at Monk's Cross. There's no one at Grimston Bar. So that needs to be borne in mind. Park and ride is the nearest we have. We don't have a tram, but we have park and ride. The nearest we have, and it is it's recognised very high quality public transit system for York. We have made decisions around its availability.
Yeah. Thank you, Julian. I think it's probably worth saying that notwithstanding the areas for improvement that we've discussed, it is something York does well. It can be done even better. But yeah, that shouldn't be lost in all of the back and forth, should it? But I'm grateful for your time and your answers and colleagues' questions, and wish you all the best for what comes next. I know you've put in a hell of a service to York over the years.
Well, thank you very much.
So colleagues, on work plan now, this has popped up. Sorry, Councillor Murray. Put your mic on, Councillor Murray.
Apologies.
I mean,
are we going to take a vote on our recommendations, and can we be clear on the exact wording of the recommendations?
I am not going to go into the exact wording of recommendations because we'll be here for a much longer time. I didn't pick up any expressed concern with the recommendations as they were raised, apart from the adjustment to my first one, which was around local control, which has now moved to seeking clarity on the position with the combined authority. We've never really done votes before unless there's been a distinct division across the committee. Which ones do you think require a vote, if any?
I think the issue of the local control versus maintaining influence is one where we perhaps do need to take a vote, because I think Julian's just reminded of us how integral park and ride and the arrangements we have are not just to the transport aspects that I mentioned earlier, but also to the local plan. And influence also relates to what skin you have in the game. If you give away all your assets and so on, you actually don't have much of a lever. You know, I'll come back to what Oxford's had to do. Oxford's had to employ people to consultancies to put together the desired transport strategy for its city in order to be in a strong negotiating position with its county council, because the county council didn't share its view of Oxford, and yet it was fundamental to Oxford's achievement. I think we need to maintain a strong position in the future. So I prefer your original formulation.
Okay. Fair comment, Councillor Merritt. Councillor Whitcroft, did you want to come in on that? Okay, Councillor Stewart.
So I was just going to suggest we therefore leave out that recommendation, because rather than put members in a decision whether they go with your expertise, Councillor Merritt, or Councillor Healy's expertise, and then we'll sort of fine call of how it sort of sits, I thought we might be best going for all the consensus-based recommendations where I think we are all unanimous, rather than having that one, because I'm also mindful that, you know, the issue about local control, there's so many variables we don't know, aren't there? And then there's, you know, that we can't know possibly, and there's so many aspects we haven't properly explored. So for this committee to agree a 5-4 or 3-4 recommendation on it, I just think it is not sensible. I would suggest we just leave that out and go for what we've got the consensus.
Do you think, Councillor Stewart, there is room for a recommendation which urges the executive member to seek clarity on the future position of Park and Ride and maximising local influence, notwithstanding the fact that there are many uncertainties with future governance? Councillor Fenton.
And keep
Well, you know,
and keep all options open, and then that we're not ruling anything out. I think that's yes. It's trying to it's make sure everybody has something. Well, it's pragmatism.
Goes with the microphone, yeah. Councillor Merritt, can you?
I'll live with your reformulation.
Thank you. Appreciate it's very heavily caveated, but we're in a strange position, and you know, I think we've had many sort of motions over the years that have expressed York's position on wanting more control or retaining control on its bus services. But I will draw this item to a close. Thank you all. Thanks again, Julian and James. Work plan is the next item. We've got a few pressing asks. One on Res Park, which I know Councillor Whitcroft has made representations on tonight. And thank you to Councillor Avilius, forgive me, sorry. Another representation to have this property asset portfolio review. I'll do my best to get that in because it would be really helpful and useful. Reviewing the city's economic strategy. I mean, that's a biggie. I mean, we have the current sort of standing list. Some of those items still need to be placed into months. Conscious that scrutiny is you know, facing review as well. If there's anything pressing that you think hasn't been raised to date, then let me know. Yeah, and then I was basically going to say the future chair of whatever this committee looks like will likely see most of those items through, hopefully. Councillor Merritt.
Yes, while we've got the director here, I just wondered if we could just test when we might be able to have a decent look at the success otherwise around the BSIP. The BSIP, the original BSIP, formally finishes at the end of this financial year in a week's time. There was a commitment to review at the end of the BSIP period by the enhanced bus partnership. So if that review is going to take place over the next couple of months, when would be the best time that we could see that and look at the issues around? There's a whole set of bus issues listed at the end, when we could have a good comprehensive look at what we've achieved, where we need to go next, what our asks are potentially of the MCA, and so on.
Thanks, councillor Merritt. Any idea on a?
Without wanting to turn it into another session like tonight, I think we need a bit of clarity from the MCA, because we know that DfT are saying future BSIPs will absolutely be through the MCA. They won't be to us as a local authority. So my instinct is that would be September time, by the time you got that level of clarity from the MCA, realistically, is my instinct. They literally have 3 members of staff around transport at the moment, that's it. So I think for them to get clarity of position, I think you are probably looking at September time, really, to get a decent update on where we are at with BSIP and what the future looks like, because there will be that transition of what we are delivering versus what they are seeing as future iterations of BSIP. And that could possibly pick up some of the conversations from tonight then as well.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Okay, I'm getting no aggressive hands, so I will call that item to a close. I have no urgent business and the meeting's over. Thank you all for your contributions tonight.